Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to chapel today. Today's chapel is hosted together with the chapel team, the Latinx caucus, the Black caucus, and we are, as part of Hispanic Heritage Month, focusing on Blackness in the Latina community, AfroLatinidad, and the problem of anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. And so today's chapel is one of three different events that will be hosted as part of Hispanic Heritage Month. The first one was 10 days ago. Josué was with us leading a contemplative practice. And there are some, if you missed that chapel, there are some pamphlets here at the entrance or the back that talk a little bit about contemplation and Blackness, and so I encourage you to take one on the way out. The other event is a little bit later this afternoon. We'll be screening the documentary Faith and Blackness. That's at 3 o'clock in AD 30. Josué is one of the producers of that film. We'll also have another producer, Yolanda Santiago Correa, with us to do a Q&A and talk. And the third event is this chapel, in which we've invited Josué to be back with us to talk about Blackness and faith and the importance of that. And so Josué is has been quickly becoming a close friend of the Union community, and so many of you know him, but I'll introduce him quickly. Josué serves as the executive director of the AfroLatina Forum, is the director of Black Lives in Contemplation, is a pastor at Metro Hope Church, co-curator of the Afro-Latino Theology Project, and was executive producer of the documentary Faith and Blackness. He's also an author, a speaker, and just today was confirmed to continue in discernment for the priesthood in the Episcopal Church. So please join me in welcoming Josué.
No, that's so fun. Thank you so much, Larry. Larry sharing up-to-the-date information. I am beginning the process, and I was confirmed to continue. And those of you who are Episcopal connected or Episcopal adjacent know that there's many steps in the process, and so the beginning step. But I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to be invited and grateful to have a lot of connections here in the Union community. And so I'm really thankful for that. Larry and Sarah, Dean Montes, and others with whom I have engaged with many times. And so this is a real honor. This is going to be like a mini sermon-ish kind of talk. So it's just a little bit. And then we're going to open it for questions or comments or anything. If I say something, you're like, whoa, what does that mean? Then just save that, because what we want to do, and that's why we're in a circle, we're going to move this, and I'll sit in the circle, and we'll participate in a round circle sharing type so that we all have our voices heard. And like Larry said, last week we led this incredible Musica Divina practice, and there's some information on contemplation and stuff there, so if you want to grab some of that, feel free. But before I officially begin, I always like to begin our time with honoring ancestors, especially ancestors that are important for us. So while I mention the names of three, I want you to maybe close your eyes or think of who are ancestors that mean something to you. Who are ancestors that helped you get here today? All of us have someone behind us who allowed us to get to where we are. So just take a few seconds. Think of a name, a few names. For me, the ancestors that come to mind whenever I talk about Blackness and Latinidad are Miriam Jimenez Roman, Juan Flores, and my father, Flores Miro Perea Renteria. They are just a few of the countless people who have always helped us and paved the way for me to really learn and talk about Blackness and Latinidad. And if you have a name that's important to you, maybe recite it to yourself, thanking them for their ability to bring you here to this moment. Thank you. I always tell us to do that because we think sometimes ancestral remembrance is a thing, but ancestral remembrance happens all the time. The transfiguration in Christian lore is literally Jesus talking to two ancestors, be like, oh, yo, I'm on your shoulders, I'm about to do this thing. That's what that is, and so we all have that connection with us. So I was invited here to talk about, to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month, and I was glad when the Latinx Caucus emailed me and talked about the idea of wanting to make sure that this Latinx Heritage Month, we center Blackness in these conversations and celebrations about Latinidad. And that was important. It's something that we don't always do. It was good because it's something that people don't always do. Usually when we think Latinx Heritage Month, we don't think of someone who looks like me because I'm actually more light-skinned. I'm a little more Latinx looking for some people. But if I was a little darker, if I just talk about hip-hop only, it's like, oh, I don't know if that counts. So it was really important to do that because there's a tendency to not center or even discuss Blackness, even though many of the people that we consider Latinx are in fact very Black. And Latinidad is a very Black concept, or a very Black, let's call it cultural identity. Most of the people who were enslaved and suffered ma'afa is a word for the great pain, which some of you know, of the transatlantic slave trade. Some of the people who were enslaved, majority, about 90% of them were in what today we call Latin America and the Caribbean. Only about 5% to 10% came to what we know as the United States. So there's many people. The UN estimates that there's between 250 million and 300 million people who are Black or of Black heritage in Latin America. That is not what you think when you think of Latin America, because the image that you get told is a different image, except if you watch Copa America. You watch Copa America, there's only like one white team. The rest of the teams are Black. Very Black: Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, less so Uruguay, less so Argentina, but there's a complicated history for that. I can talk to you about why that is. All of the other ones are mostly Black. Bolivia, not as much, but there's usually that happen. Venezuela, very Black. So why is that? And why is it that we believe that Latinidad has this innate anti-Blackness built into it? And what is anti-Blackness? Anti-Blackness is defined as the beliefs and actions that devalue and marginalize Black people. It's a systemic denial of Black humanity and dignity. And it also renders anything associated with Blackness as unworthy. We know this. We know this in our culture because our culture, especially the American culture, has done that for so many times, has done so much work on anti-Blackness that anything happens. Christianity as a tool, even though I'm a Christian and I'm a devout Christian and I'm in the process of the priesthood, Christianity was one of the tools that literally was like anything that's Africa is Black and therefore is bad. Demonic was always a term associated with the continent of Africa. That's why it was called the dark continent, the bad continent, anything demonic. You'll see that in the film later. We explain that a little bit in the film, a very little bit. The Council of Democratizing Education defines anti-Blackness as a two-part system, though. First, there's the overt racism, right? Regular racism that we sadly know all too well. Discriminatory policies in different places, people to people and institutions. And then there's the second one, which is the really more insidious, was an unethical disregard for all things that are Black. Often often this is done by people who benefit from making sure that happens. And that is because anti-Blackness is rooted in this idea of ethno-racial hierarchy. Specifically, Latin America has something that many scholars have called a pigmentocracy. There's 21 or 18, or depending on which caste system you look at in Latin America, there's a whole different list of who ranks in this caste system, in this pigmentocracy. And usually darker skinned people, usually indigenous and people of African descent, were at the bottom of this pigmentocracy, and white people, or people who would be racialized as white, because whiteness was not an idea until much later, would be at the top. And this ethno-racial hierarchy that created this barrier has real economic and social and political consequences. As lighter skin tones were viewed more intellectual, more talented, more more worthy of social and human rights. Darker skinned folks were considered not to be that. And so what started to happen in Latin America, because of the different understanding of Latin America, because of this caste system, right? 21, 18, 36. What I'm referring to when I say this, there's one surviving painting of the Spaniards literally painted this, have it around so that you can see like, oh, if you're white European, you're at the top. If you're white, but you were born in Colombia, for example, you were lower than a white European person. And then if you were mixed, it was this whole crazy thing. I can share an image with Larry if you want to see it. But if you want to look for it, you can Google it. It's called Las Castas, or the caste. And there's like one or few surviving paintings that show that. And so one of the concepts within there, though, that started to really problematize, that to really started to actually complicate the issue for the Europeans, was this idea that there were a lot of people who were of indigenous descent mixing with a lot of people of white descent. There was a lot of people of black descent mixing with a lot of people of white descent, what we would now call white black. And so then in Latin America, nation-state building projects started to happen called mestizaje. Mestizo is an identity. It's an identity, it's a racialized category that is technically the official definition is of a white person who's of European descent mixed with someone who's of indigenous descent from Latin America, what we call today Latin America. But it became a project to really, an anti-black project, an anti-indigenous project to really lower other identities to the lowest of the caste by highlighting one identity and making it the normative identity. Sometimes so there have been people who have thought that mestizaje is a good thing. Mestizaje, this idea of being mestizo, that is a good thing. It includes all of us. We're all included in this idea of mestizaje. But the reality is that it only includes a more nuanced, a more new identity and identification. It really lowers anyone who remains indigenous, who remains black. It doesn't consider them as part of the nation state. By prioritizing this mestizo ideal, it marginalizes black and indigenous identity while still valuing whiteness. It downplays the significant contributions of specific groups that have shaped Latin American societies. So how do we solve this issue? There's this innate anti-blackness that sometimes is part of Latinx culture, sadly, that has been a part of the conversations. You see it throughout. If any of you have connections to Latin America, you know that this plays out. Different people live in different areas. I'm Colombian. I was born in Bogota. In Bogota, the richer people live in the north of Bogota. Usually tend to be a little bit more lighter in skin, usually a little bit more, they'll claim their heritage is always Spaniard. All of them always say, like, I'm from Spain. My heritage is Spaniard. And the poorer people tend to live in the south of the city, right, in the south of Bogota, and usually tend to be a little bit more mixed, a little bit darker skinned, a little bit more working class. There's a whole way we can talk about how class and race always mix, which I think you all have a lot of language around, but this is a reality in Latin America. So how do we solve this, right? We think that Latin America has this image. We believe that Latin America has this image of one thing, but now I'm telling you that there's a different image, there's a more diverse image. All of the music and food and culture that is Latin America has a lot of African and indigenous influences, even if you did not know that. And the only way that we solve that is really by centering other narratives. The way that I work on it personally is by centering my black narratives, by centering my blackness. Combating anti-blackness begins with acknowledging that Latinx people are anti-black, can be anti-black. We have to understand that while all Latinxes, that while all people who may be considered Latinx or Hispanic or whatever term we use, that doesn't mean that everyone is the same. Latinx is an ethnic identity, not a racial identity, unlike what the census has tried to tell us in the last change that they made to make Latinx a racial category. In this room, there are many of us who are Latinx, and we all have different racial identities based on where we are. And we are racialized differently based on what sociologists call street race. Street race is that sociologists believe that the best way to actually write down your racial identity, your racialized identity, is how are you treated when you walk down the street? When you walk down the street, how are you treated in the world? Because you can have an ideological thing, be like, oh, well, I really think that I'm whatever, I don't know. I'm gonna say black. I mean, I am treated as a black, but let's just say, but if I'm not treated like that, is that real my racialized identity? And how am I treated in the world? Different Latinx people can experience different discrimination. But it's shown statistically that darker skinned people, for example, always suffer more discrimination at the hands of police than lighter skinned Latinas. This is within the Latina population. Lighter skinned Latinas suffer more. In New York City, there was a time, even though there's still always times, but there was a time when there was a policy that you may have heard of called stop and frisk. Stop and frisk was a policy that stopped all these people. And so the numbers will get reported like, well, it's all these people that get stopped, and it's mostly Latinos that get stopped. But when we at the Afro-Latino Forum looked at the numbers of Latinas that got stopped, Latinxes that got stopped, out of Latinx that got stopped, 70% of those were dark-skinned Latinos. So you could say whatever the numbers were, and it was just always thrown like black and Latinos get stopped the most, sure. But out of Latinos, it was darker-skinned Latinos. It wasn't lighter-skinned Latinos getting stopped. That's because it's always racialization is a problem, right? This anti-blackness is a problem that still has that. And so we have to break these cycles of anti-blackness, of internalized anti-blackness in our communities. We have to also then start to break the cycles, and one of the ways that we do is by learning the diversity of Latinidad, learning the diversity of these perspectives. Scholar Loria Garcia Peña argues that one of the ways that we can combat this whitewashing a myth of Latinidad is that we have to confront two important truths that are really important for the Latinx cause overall, for Latinidad overall: Black liberation and immigrant rights. She says that these struggles are connected and cannot be separated when we work to dismantle anti-Blackness in our communities. Many of the policies that we see this government enacting now, but that has enacted for many years, that are anti-immigration policies, have always put Black Latinx people at the fringe of both a very racialized experience and also a limiting experience of migration. At the border, I've only gone to the border once to do some work at the border. They were separating out. They couldn't figure out that there were these black folk who spoke Spanish, so they really couldn't figure them out. So they would put them with all the other black folk, right? Like, so people from the continent of Africa, people from Haiti, people from the Caribbean, they would put them all together, and they would put all the lighter skin, or let's say more indigenous looking Latinas in a different part, and then the lighter skin Latinas in another part. And so then I remember, because I was brought in to talk to a priest there who was, I forget what denomination, I think he was Presbyterian or Methodist, but he was like, I don't know how to service some of the black people, is basically what he was saying. And I was like, well, you know, those black people are Latino just like you. You just have to speak to them in Spanish. And he was confounded by a dark-skinned face that was also migrating at the border, because that's not the image that he got. And so I think what Loria Garcia Peña says here is really important. Black liberation and immigrant rights are really important. When we center the stories of Afro-Latinx people, when we center the story about Blackness and Latinx culture, we then start to gain a more profound understanding of Latinidad. And I think that then helps us to see the intersectionality that connects us, the ways that we are always connected. And what I always think is that it helps us really get more in touch with our own spirituality. W.B. Du Bois spoke of a concept that you may have heard of called double consciousness for African Americans, which is African Americans are always dealing with two ideas at one time: being black in this country and then being American. What does that mean when those two things? Miriam Jimenez Roman, my mentor, my ancestor, who means a lot to me, spoke of triple consciousness. She was like, well, for Black Latinos, we have to deal with, what does it mean that I'm Latino in this country? What does that mean? What does it mean that I'm black in this country? And what does it mean that I'm American in this country? And I think I always say then quadruple consciousness, because then now I have to deal with I'm black, I'm Latino, I'm in this country, I'm American, but I'm Christian, or whatever religious identity I have. What does that mean? How do they all interplay? And the reason why I bring that up and why I think that that's important to understand is because one of the things that can help us each individually is to start to understand the different identities that live within us. We are not all just one identity. We have multiple identities. What women calls it, there are multitudes within us. And James Baldwin says, all of us suffer at the hand of being told what we are. All of us, black people, white people, Latina people, all people suffer at the hand of being told what we are. And I think that embracing Afro-Latinidad, embracing a way that with learning about it can help you get in touch with your own multifaceted identity. I really believe that AfroLatinx understand God as being directly involved in bringing peace, stopping armed conflict, and being present, because that's something that we've had to do in our own stories. I always say that the concept of the Trinity is not so difficult to understand, as theologically complicated as it might be. It's not that difficult to understand if you understand your own intersectionalized identity. There are many beings living with you right now. Not saying that that's what the divine is. I'm just saying that that's not as complicated a thought when you start to think of your own way in which you have different multitudes living within you. And I just think that we need to just allow our imagination to go in different places. If we allow our imagination to really allow us to open up to diverse expressions of Latinidad, right? Understanding that Latinos are also Black, while Latinos are white, while Latinos are mestizo, while Latinos are indigenous, then we start to open up more possibilities. 1/3 of indigenous people in this country, by the way, are self-identified as Latino, which is a big population. It's not usually what we think. And this reminds me of a song called Si Dios Fuera Negro by Roberto Anglera. It's a salsa song. You can put it on Apple Music or whatever app you use to listen to music later. Si Dios Fuera Negro is a great song. It was inspired by the civil rights movement. He was in Puerto Rico. He saw what's going on in the civil rights movement. And he was like, man, I really want to write something about that. And the song chorus says, if God were Black, everything would be different. The Pope would be Black. The minister would be Black. The angels would be Black. Jesus Christ would be Black. And we know that Jesus was a Palestinian man living under the oppression of the Roman Empire. We know that there's a context for what he's saying. But what he's saying is that imagining God in a different way allows us to then imagine our faith in a different way, our spirituality in a different way. What Roberto Anglero was saying, like, if God were Black, then we could reimagine certain aspects of my faith, is what he's saying for himself. Imagine that, and then he says, imagine what that could do for the whole society. And so I think centering different narratives, embracing and learning about different narratives can help us within ourselves learn about how we can see the divine and how that can shift our perspective. Imagining God as Black won't magically solve all injustices. It's not, right? Knowing that God has knowing that Jesus was a brown body in this world does not change all injustices. But it does expand our understanding of God and how God relates to the oppressed, and therefore God relates to us individually. By broadening our view of God, we are then able to broaden our understanding of life, humanity, and our faith. And this, I think, is what empowers us to fight for a more just world. Thank you.
So in this next set of minutes together, we'll open up the floor for any questions or reflections you might have for Josué, but I think also so that we can be in dialogue with each other on what Josué has shared with us this afternoon. So the team will come around with another mic. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, a question, a reflection, or a comment.
Or clarification.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how you always bring up how important it is for us to remember, those of us who are Latinx, that we are colonized in one way or another. And like even indigenous Latinx people, you know, we speak the colonizer language, etc. And I want to ask you, how do you feel about that separation that we, Latinos and Latinas and Latinx, we do for each other, even when we're like in the United States, where we're the minority, you know, but we still try to separate ourselves from each other?
Yeah, I think that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to say. That it's innate within Latinidad, right? I know that sounds like, oh my God, is it always like that? But Latinidad as a concept was really built to overemphasize one identity, where it really is a mestizo identity, and to de-emphasize any other identity. I'm gonna say something that I wouldn't say all the time. Even white Latina identity is not centered in the Latinidad context. People sometimes don't understand that there can be white Latinos, like really like, let's call it, I don't like the word Caucasian, but I'm gonna use it just for reference, Caucasian. Like sometimes I tell them like, oh, you know that person's Latina. What? That person can't. That person looks German. That person looks whatever it is that we understand. And so because it's done that, there is this innate anti-blackness within it and anti-indigeneity within it. I speak mostly of anti-blackness because that's my personal experience, but there's a lot of anti-indigeneity in that. It's all the same. Usually indigenous and black folk in Latin America were always at the bottom of that caste system. Everyone else was on top. And I think that it just happens because there's multiple reasons. I think I'm gonna say there's one reason is because we recreate our own social context from where we grew up. So, for example, when I came here to New York City, I came because my father was offered to be a pastor of a South American church. My father was a dark-skinned black man. I can guarantee you, this is before social media. It wasn't many pictures that they had of him. I'm sure that when he went to preach the first time, that's the guy from Colombia, that's the lawyer from Colombia. That's not the image that they had of a lawyer, educated guy from Colombia. And I know that because then he suffered a lot of anti-black racism from within his church that he was pastoring because of his blackness. And so we try to replicate that, number one. I think a second big reason is because then we start to learn the one drop rule here. So it's like, oh, I just have to get closer to whiteness. Okay, bet. Then I have to lower what I consider indigenous or whatever to get closer to that, which we see politically acting out now, and the way that some more white Cubans vote, for example, in Florida and in other places. But it's just a part of it. I mean, my personal story, I remember having a girlfriend, Puerto Rican girl, white Puerto Rican girl. Her grandma was like, oh, he's a smart guy, but he's black, and you can't stay with that guy. And she didn't. She then went with a white American guy. Like, it was like, that's where she went. Like, she broke up with me and literally dated a white American guy. And that's just the story, because then we need to approach and get closer to whiteness, right? This mejorando la raza, which we know in Latinx context, bettering the race. It's a concept that exists all throughout the world. It's not just in Latinidad, but I think with Latinidad, because of the proximity to the US, then it creates this idea like, let's go to that. And then I think the third thing is because mestizaje is usually understood as a way to mix indigenous culture and let's call it white culture broadly. But the reality is, and there are many better people here who can talk about it at Union, but the reality is that mestizaje literally uplifts only localized what then becomes white concept in that place. So for example, in Colombia, mestizo identity always overemphasizes some indigenous thing, like let's do that. But that's not a way to really uplift indigenous thing. Is to get everyone to buy into that, but really downgrade everything else. So it's like, the Aymara, the Aymara people were so great. But then they'll do that, and then it's like, let's move on. And that's why every president actually Colombia's first president was a black man. Every other person has been white. Is because that idea is just embedded, right? Who is the one who can make decisions? Who is the one that can do that? So I think those three things are the things that play a role, right? We recreate systems in our communities. There's the proximity to whiteness here, I think, then creates that idea to replicate it. And a really good book to talk about if you're all interested in learning more about it is called Racial Innocence by Tania Hernandez. Racial Innocence, she literally talks about the way that Latinos are anti-black, and she talks about anti-blackness in Latino communities. It's a really excellent book. I see one hand there, then I see now like 5 hands, so we'll go there. Okay, you'll go next. Okay, we'll go here, then we'll go there.
Thank you for the sermon/teaching that you gave earlier. It was really profound. Question that I had was regarding how some of the immigrants that have came here from different Latinx communities, particularly the Dominican Republic that I'm thinking of in mind now, that they were taught that their identity that as a means of survival, and now that particularly in Washington Heights, where my wife and I stay now, it's kind of been like a running joke. Oh, I know black. I know black. Like there are comedians that have done jokes and just different things about how Dominicans don't identify as black. How do you, I guess, communicate or conversate with someone who was taught that as a means of survival to kind of bring them to a place where they are able to identify or value their heritage?
Well, the Dominican question is always a problem. Is anyone Dominican in the room? Because they maybe could speak. I'm going to share some thoughts. I'm not Dominican, but this is known. These are facts. I was that Dominican Republic was controlled by a dictator. The dictator wanted to approximate to whiteness. He actually, the word that some scholars use is imported, but I don't like to use that word with people. But he expanded immigration policies in the Dominican Republic to allow more white people from Europe to go to the Dominican Republic to whiten the country. He felt the country was too black. They created, Dominican Republic is a black country. That they self-recognize as black is a whole different question in the country. And so there's a lot of history there with the dictator and how it started. There was a genocide that he committed of a lot of Haitians folks, and the Supreme Court in the Dominican Republic right now, actually, if anyone's born of Haitian heritage in the Dominican Republic, what they determine Haitian heritage really is darker skin. They get removed from they get their citizenship canceled. So there's a crazy situation happening right now in DR where many dark-skinned people are just losing their citizenship left and right, then being shipped over to Haiti or left what the UN calls stateless. Like they literally have no state because they're not from Haiti, they're from DR, but DR has canceled their citizenship based on these random things. It's this crazy situation that's happening right now in the Dominican Republic. There's a really great movie if you want to learn about it called Stateless. And there's a film festival that always happens that's about to start. Actually starts in 2 weeks. I can send Larry the info, called the Dominican Love Haitians Film Festival, and they show a lot of films about it. The only reason why I say that is because in the national consciousness of the Dominican Republic, there has been this idea to see blackness as evil, and so to overemphasize indigeneity, even though there is no indigeneity left in the Dominican Republic. So people in the Dominican Republic, dark-skinned people will say, I'm Indio, but I'm not black. Which is where, for example, Cardi B changes that thing. Cardi B is like, oh, I'm black. I don't know what this Indio thing means. Like to use someone like that she's here. And here in the US, I'm gonna get to your question in a second, I'm just giving some context. Here in the US, younger Dominicans are the second most likely Latinos to answer that they're black. So there's a change happening. There's the way that the society considers the Dominican Republic, but younger Dominicans in the US are the second most likely Latinos to select that they're black. It's Panamanians and then Dominicans. So that means there's a shift in the narrative. Many of the writers that are doing a lot of really good work on writing, like Elizabeth Acevedo, they're Dominican and they're highlighting that. Zoe Saldana, she's highlighting her blackness and not highlighting another identity. So I think that I like to highlight that because the Dominican Republic does create a problem that you see a very black person telling you that they're not black, but it's because in the social legend of the Dominican Republic, that's the way that is. Like Dominican Republic is the only country that celebrates 2 Independence Days. One from Spain and one from their myth-making of saying Haiti was trying to take over them. So they celebrate 2. There's an independence from Spain, which is actual true independence. And then there's the perceived independence of Haiti. But Haiti actually was always said, like, we just want to help you free. Like, we got freed. But that's not how their social history tells it. So there's a lot of scholars doing a lot of work. Loria Garcia Peña, for example, is a scholar who is Dominican, censors blackness, but has also been persecuted by the white forces because of her scholarship. So there is a shift happening, I would believe. I think the way that I talk to people, because your question is, how do I talk to people who do that? I always use Frantz Fanon's definition, which I think I mentioned last week, did I? Maybe, I mention it all the time. Frantz Fanon in Black Faces, White Mask, it's a really great book in the 5th chapter. He talks about the essence or the fact of blackness. And what he says is that the essence or the fact of blackness is the lived experience of the black person, which I think we can extrapolate to any identity. Your lived experience really is the evidence or the essence of your experience of who you are in the world. So that's kind of how I talk about it to people, like their lived experience is that. And it takes a lot of work when a national myth is built around anti-blackness, like as it is in the Dominican Republic. But it does work, and I would say that younger Dominicans are the ones that are more leading that charge now. Many of the Afro-Latinx writers that we read now are all Dominican, or at least Dominican mix or Dominican adjacent, and have started to center their blackness as a way to fight back against the narrative of their nation, but also to realize their lived experience in the world. So I know that was a long answer, but I wanted to give some context.
Yeah, so my question is, I want to hear your thoughts on it. And as we are actively, or you're urging us to actively dismantle anti-blackness, how do we make sure that we are not, in the process of dismantling anti-blackness and the methods of anti-blackness, we are not creating a new form of anti-whiteness?
Yeah.
And how does the marginalizing, dismantling the anti-blackness reimagine accountability? Because sometimes in the process of being the marginalized side and decolonizing something, it's easy to detach from being accountable. So how does the person in the place of anti-blackness reimagine accountability, that they do not fall into creating a system of anti-whiteness?
That's a deep question, and I think I was just discussing this with a Puerto Rican scholar, because there is something that can pull us in the wrong direction when it's race essentialism, right? It's like race essentialism. Centering one story doesn't mean that all the other stories are devalued. It's like, let me just center this story so at least we learn a different perspective and our reference point is different. I think that one of the ways that I think about it is really to look towards, so in the Black liberation ideology, there was a group of writers called the Combahee River Collective. I don't know if y'all are familiar. Combahee River Collective wrote a statement, and in their statement they say, we believe that if we free Black people, Black women specifically, the liberation of Black women would mean the upending of the entire structure that has created inequality, and therefore would free everyone from the I forget the way that shackles, let's call it, of this racialized system, right? The reality, I think, when I think about dismantling anti-Blackness, I really think of dismantling the myth about race and race essentialism, understanding that we are all racialized, right? Everyone's racialized. James Baldwin says everyone's racialized. All of us are racialized in different ways, different perspectives, different constructs. And so we have to then understand how we are racialized, what our intersections are, and then how connectedness we are. John Mbiti, who's this Kenyan philosopher, in this book that he has, is an incredible book called African Philosophy and Religions, he says that essentializing race doesn't necessarily solve the problem. What solves the problem is essentializing shared humanity, essentializing shared humanity. But in order to do that, because of the hundreds of years of white privilege and white supremacy that have to happen, we have to de-emphasize white supremacy. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said one time, de-emphasizing that sometimes feels like, what is it she called it? For a white person could feel like it's discriminatory because it's de-emphasizing something that has always been the reference point. So I always say the main way to do that is just to change reference points, but without attacking, right? It's just, let me change a reference point. So instead of me quoting whoever I always quote, if I always quote, I don't know, Luther or whatever, Barth or whatever, let me quote John Mbiti and give you this Kenyan philosopher. Let me quote Frantz Fanon. Let me quote a different reference point. Let me start to bring more people into the reference point, because then that just starts to change what I think we think normative. So I think that's the best way to do it. I do think it's a struggle, and I think that there's always going to be a pull for that. But if we look at the people who were fighting for and continue to fight for Black liberation, they had always said Black liberation is not the oppression of other people. Black liberation is the ending of the system that created Blackness to be oppressed. And I think that is how we get there. I think it's a multifaceted challenge, but I think that's the challenge. And I think that's the goal of Black liberation.
Hello? Oh. I just wanted to add to that. I'm a genealogist as well. And some of one point I want to make is that when we personalize it, that does make a difference. I worked with someone who was Dominican, and he did his DNA. And although he was a fairer skin, person, he saw his African ancestry and the ancestry of the colonizer. And that changed his perspective on how he identified himself. Then too, I've helped people who were white, who looked into their genealogy and found where they came from. They're German, they're this. And so whiteness sort of becomes this cloak of not identifying culture as well. And there should also be tapping into like, who are you? Like, where do you come from? You're not American by lineage. We all came from somewhere else. So where do you come from? And so there's this cloak of calling yourself white or black that de-emphasizes, your own lineage. And so I think when it's personalized, that can make a difference on how we accept the duality and the diversity of who we are.
Yeah, that's what I just want. I really looked what Baldwin says. Baldwin literally says like everyone is racialized in one way. White people are told that they're white by a system that wants you to believe that your whiteness does this thing. Black people are told that they're black by a system. And I think once we start to understand that, then it's true personalized. I have a white side of my family too, and I have a very indigenous side of my family. Well, let me just say who they just discovered that they were indigenous because the white side of the family told them that they were not white. And so they came to us, the black side of the family, we're like, how do y'all handle this? And I remember we were like, welcome to the club. Let me help you understand that but it's because of the self-projection. And it does change. And so in my own family, I have the three, what in Mexican culture they call las tres raíces de la cultura, right? White, indigenous, and black. And let me tell you, the indigenous folk are struggling because their self-image had always been, but they talk to us, how do you comb your hair? They ask my sister. Like basic things like that. That does humanize it because they're realizing their daughters, because their children are not looking like the white side of the family and are being treated differently. So that does change it. And so then once you personalize it, it helps a lot. Because the idea, I really do believe in what Audre Lorde said, the idea is to free all of us, right? That it's all of us are oppressed by the system. Even the person at the top of the system is enslaved by the system. So all of us are oppressed by the system. And what we really need to do is abolish and destroy the system. How we do that, it takes a long time. It's going to take a lot of working together. It's going to take people in power using their privilege and their power to upend the system. It takes those of us who may be always lower in the power dynamic to make that aware. And that takes a lot of humility. But I think it goes back to what Baldwin says, it takes love. Baldwin always said, in order for us to do that, the world will be kept together and liberation will come by the few people who really want to embrace love. And I think that's what it does. I know that we have one more hand. I spoke too much. Last one? Okay, last one. Well, I see one hand there, and then I can stay around and we can talk after. Go ahead.
So I wonder what you think. So you were talking about the mestizos. And my mom's from Colombia, and I know that within the history of Colombia, as well as throughout much of Latin America, another form of erasure was this institutionalized yet not usually spoken idea of breeding out African and indigenous peoples by having white people, for lack of a better way of putting it, raping women from the black and indigenous cultures, so that way it lessened that blood, and how that also affects this concept not just of mestizo, but also true elimination, of true genocide really, by quote unquote breeding out, by whitening the communities that were brought there or that were indigenous over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence for that. Technically, there are no Tainos left in the world, technically speaking. Now, if you're of a country that knows Taino, Tainos are an indigenous people that were actually a migrant indigenous people that lived in Florida, Bahamas, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti. The name of the island is actually Haiti. That name of where Dominican Republic and Haiti are is called Haiti. That's why they named it there. And so technically speaking, there are no Tainos left, let's call it full-blooded or whatever we want to say, even though all of those things are kind of part of the racial essentialism that sometimes we have to fight against. But it's true. and actually there's evidence, it's not even hidden, that in Colombia, Santander, who was one of the presidents of Colombia, was exchanging letters with the Argentinian president and the Chilean president on how to lower blackness and indigeneity in their countries. And they would literally be like, oh, you know, the Argentinians did this, and they put all the indigenous in this part, and they put all the black people over here, and you know, black people can't handle cold, so then they'll die. Like literally, these are letters that exist that you can read. And so then there was this state building project of overemphasizing mestizaje and mestizo identity. And so I think the way to, you know, is to expose that reality, that is a true part of Latinidad, right? I think that we don't think about it all the time, but it is something that really happens. We see it when we look at most Latino TV. If you look at Spanish language TV doesn't often feature a face that looks like me or darker than me. Now a little bit more, but there was a time when it wasn't. There's definitely no time when it features indigenous looking people. And if you remember that movie Roma, problematic as that movie was, at least it featured an indigenous character. People threw a lot of hatred towards her because of her indigeneity. So I think there's a lot of realizing that Latinidad is not a one racialized identity, and it is not one single way of understanding Latinidad. I know that makes it harder to think, but no nationality is really like that. No ethnic group is like, no cultural group is like that. American culture is very diverse in its own way. So anyway, so I think we're at time. So that's that. I hope I answered.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I'm sure we can share your information. I'm certain he'll be back several times. Thank you. Can we thank him, please?